So we're going to take the conversation really from the world of research and evidence into a framing of children's rights. And I'm going to talk for a bit just explaining how we did what is maybe one of the last reports of ySKILLS. It's just gone online, so I forgive you all for not having read it already. It was co-authored with Maria Stoilova, who's here, and Miriam Rahali, who is currently in the US. So we wanted to kind of move from, if you like, description, how are children gaining digital skills, what do they know, to the normative. What should they know? What digital skills should be developed of value to them and of value in what kinds of ways? So we're working, so here is a colourful vision of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child produced by UNICEF. And what I find in explaining a child rights framing is people either know this diagram backwards or they're looking at it for the first time thinking, oh, that's a lot of rights, and what are they all, and what lies behind those words. So, I mean, just very briefly, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child encapsulates human rights, because children are human, and it adds some. And some of the ones it adds are super interesting, like the idea that a child should be treated according to their best interests, according to their evolving capacity, because of course they are developing, that they have the right to play, which sadly adults don't get in other human rights instruments. There's a few differences, but if you think of it as human rights plus, and then the other comment I get is that 42 rights is a lot to try to map to the enormous body of evidence that you have already been hearing about today. So we're going to do a little distillation in terms of child rights principles. So the question we asked in our part of ySKILLS was to say, what difference does digital skills and literacy make to the child rights agenda? And I should have said, of course, that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most ratified human rights treaty globally, ratified by every country in the world, apart from the United States, regrettably, for many reasons, but one, that many digital companies are headquartered in the US. So there is a kind of an interesting debate around internet governance, tech regulation, and a child rights agenda. But of course, here from a European perspective, all the member states have ratified the convention, which means they have committed to following and realizing children's rights in this regard, and to incorporating the convention into national legislation. So our question within that kind of enormous framework is to say, do digital skills matter? And we asked the question in two ways. Firstly, when we see in the ySKILLS research, when we see children and young people gaining digital skills, do we see ways in which this facilitates their rights, the realization of their rights? Does it offer them these benefits? And secondly, again in the ySKILLS research, which gives us a lot of context about children's lives, do we see ways in which the insufficient realization of children's rights is impeding their capacity to gain digital skills and literacy? So we kind of asked the question these two ways round. So to make the work manageable and kind of organize the work for ourselves, we have worked with 11 child rights principles, which were developed by the Digital Futures Commission with the Five Rights Foundation. And it was a way of generating a kind of synthesis of the full convention into principles that policymakers and producers of digital products and services could work with. So we could say to someone developing something for AI, or developing a new digital toy for children, or developing a digital literacy curriculum even. These are the principles. Do you realize these principles in the design of your product, the design of your service, the design of your policy? And then we wanted to map these to the ySKILLS evidence. So the principles you can read for yourselves. I won't read them out. But just to take the first, equity and diversity. There's a lot in the Convention on the Rights of the Child about the different kinds of disadvantage, the different kinds of barriers, the different kinds of exclusion that children might suffer. So we wrap up those articles within the principle of equity and diversity, and then we make the normative claim that those designing the digital environment should be inclusive, treat everyone fairly, provide for diverse needs and circumstances. If you like, it's a simple statement that they could think about, that they could maybe put on the wall of the design studio or the policy workshop or office, and kind of operate as a checklist. And in the full report from the Digital Futures Commission, of course, there's a lot to explain how the convention maps into these principles. So we've been working with these principles, and we undertook several kinds of mapping. First, actually, a policy mapping, and there's been quite a lot of European policy mapping across the ySKILLS research, especially as we've kind of been taking the findings into thinking about policy and practice. But what we did was to look for references to children's digital literacy, children's digital schools, in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, in General Comment 25, which is the authoritative statement by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child of how to apply the Convention in digital contexts globally, internationally, and then focusing in on European policy, we looked for what was being said about digital literacy, especially children's digital literacy and indeed children's rights, in the European Declaration on Digital Rights and Principles, in the European Strategy for Better Internet for Kids, the BIC Plus program, the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, and the Strategy on the Rights of the Child. There's a lot more that we could have drawn on there, and my colleagues have been developing that. And I'm not going to elaborate on the policy mapping here, except to make one point, which is signaled there in my subtitle, which is that by and large, digital literacy is talked about in policy frameworks as it relates to education. And everyone, there is a consensus about the importance of education for children across Europe. There is not quite such a consensus about how digital it should be and where exactly digital literacy should fit into that, as we heard in the previous panel that Veronica Donoso chaired. But there is still that commitment to and recognition digital literacy is important for education. It's important for the other rights, I would say, kind of comes and goes and is sometimes recognized and sometimes not. And so what I see us doing in this conversation now is kind of understanding that digital literacy has some broader consequences. It matters not only to support children's education, but to support their full participation as rights holders in a digital world. And so we've been reading a lot of the ySKILLS reports that have been coming out over the last years with that kind of a question in mind. What are the, yes, education, but also what would be the other rights? And I want to thank the ySKILLS colleagues here who participated in various mapping workshops that we did to kind of say, well, here are the child rights principles, and you know the evidence, and let's kind of begin to map how that might work. And some of you will remember or even see yourself pictured here. I think the kind of subtext of these workshops was puzzlement, because there was quite a lot of, how do we make the link between these particular statistical findings or these particular empirical reports and the kind of, in a way, the sort of grand agenda of realizing children's rights in a digital world. And so we all did a lot of talking. That's the first set of images, and then Maria and Miriam and I went away and we kind of wrote down what we thought everyone was telling us, and we did a kind of validation workshop in which everyone here, many people here said, no, you have the findings wrong, it's the other way round, or sometimes you have the rights wrong, it's the other way round. So we did a lot of kind of iterating. And so the report we just learned this week takes our 11 principles. We've illustrated the wonderful well-being here and does a kind of a short explanation of what kind of combination of rights are articulated in the principle of well-being, and then something about how the ySKILLS findings speak to that agenda of well-being. And I've illustrated with well-being here because in the world of ySKILLS, apart from the value of... It's okay. So apart from the agreed value of gaining digital literacy to aid with education, we have been looking in many of our reports for ways in which digital skills also enhances well-being. So well-being, which we could read in the Convention on the Rights of the Child in terms of health, in terms of fullest development, in terms of the absence of a range of forms of exclusion and problems. How does digital literacy help or maybe hinder? And so now, in summarizing what we argue, I hope my colleagues will forgive me because this is an extraordinary reduction and selection of very many arguments about children's rights and very rich and complex findings from the ySKILLS project that really is going to require everyone to read hundreds of pages of intense expert insights and research. But I'm just going to go through the 11 principles to give you a sense of how the findings of the research can map onto the principles, and a sense, therefore, of how we can make more articulate the question of how empirical social science findings about children's and young people's engagement with technology, how can that show us the way to articulating their rights on a broader landscape, and how, therefore, can we engage child rights advocates, such as Five Rights, who are funding my work on the Digital Futures Commission, such as Fabiola and her work with many NGOs through Eurochild. You know, how can we kind of bridge that evidence to advocacy? I don't want to say gap. How can we make that leap? And generate that conversation. So just to illustrate it, again, you can read for yourself, but you know, insofar as all our governments have committed to realizing equity and diversity for children and young people, including in the digital world, in relation to the digital environment, it is really relevant and pertinent that ySKILLS has produced so many findings about what Elaine Dines calls the 6 forms of vulnerability, the various forms of vulnerability and exclusion that have been very well documented, I think. And, you know, one of the findings I use here to illustrate, I think, is something that we have known in previous research. We have shown very clearly in ySKILLS research, and really matters for a child rights agenda, that again and again, those who are disadvantaged offline, who have difficulties to contend with forms of exclusion and discrimination offline, are more disadvantaged online, and those who have more have more. It is an old finding, it is newly relevant, and it really matters, I think, in some of the ySKILLS findings about how those who are a member of a discriminated group, we can now show very clearly are losing out, but maybe have opportunities also to catch up, to find new possibilities through gaining digital literacy. The second principle is that of best interest, and it's one right in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's a kind of interesting and somewhat contested right to be seen, as it were, holistically, to have all your rights taken into consideration, including your right to be heard, in articulating the way to respect a child's best interests, including at times over the commercial interests of digital companies. And I think of this principle whenever we've got some quite complicated findings that require a kind of balance of safety and or protection and participation, findings that require some nuance. So we have a lot of findings in ySKILLS about how gaining skills doesn't just deliver better well-being. For example, sometimes it leads children into more risk of harm. And we've all thought a lot about whether that, what does that mean? Because a very simple conclusion would be, well, let's not give them digital literacy. Let's not teach kids because it takes them into dangerous spaces. So we have to kind of think holistically about their best interests. You've heard a bit about consultation. I'm going to speed up now. You'll be glad to know. You've heard a bit about consultation and how ySKILLS has actually, in many ways, tried to respect Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and listen to children and consult them on matters that affect them, including, as Maria Stoylova discussed, taking the findings back to them for their recommendations to policymakers. And I think and in building the child-friendly toolkit that Bika Zaman talked about, it is very clear from our research that there are ways in which research can become part of the process of consulting children and advancing their rights. The principles are all quite, they are meant to be challenging, and they are. We have a lot of findings in ySKILLS about age. And Europe at the moment, as some of you will know, is debating an age-appropriate design code. How can the digital environment be designed in ways that are appropriate to the ages of different children? I think there's a really fantastic task, and perhaps still to be done, but also in our reports, on how children gain digital literacy with age, but also some of the complications of that. So we can make different assumptions about what children know at different ages. But again, we need that holistic approach. We need to think about the other advantages and disadvantages that shape their lives. And we need to think about whether the digital environment itself is responsive to their different ages or treats them all as if they are the same age, perhaps as if they're all children, or worse, perhaps as if they're all adult. So there are some really, kind of interesting issues to link the research and advocacy there. The principle of responsible is really pointing primarily to the obligations of the state to realize children's rights, including in a digital environment. Also the responsibilities of businesses, who are really critical in this regard. And here, one finding might be to focus on the importance of recognizing vulnerabilities among children. Not just because they are vulnerable and helpless, but because they are vulnerable and sometimes developing some interesting coping strategies, developing some particular forms of resilience, but also, as we heard earlier, finding the design of that digital environment often overpowering and very difficult to cope with. So we can't put all the burden on digital literacy. At some point we have to say, and how should regulation and business responsibility change the design of the digital environment so that digital literacy doesn't have to be the answer to everything, not the silver bullet, as I think Lane said a long time ago at the beginning of today. Participation and I think some of the kind of substantive rights are fairly obvious. I just wanted to say, yes, ySKILLS shows that gaining digital literacy broadly supports children's digital skills, broadly supports children's capacity to participate in the digital environment. But as you've heard, those different dimensions matter, and the importance of going beyond operational skills to critical and communicative skills, to civic skills, I think is a really fascinating challenge still for digital literacy educators across Europe. And privacy, similarly, we see that children with higher level of digital skills may be better able to protect their privacy online. This seems very crucial at a time when children's privacy is much under threat. The safety findings, no one would argue against the importance of children's safety online. It is interesting that higher skills are sometimes associated with more, not less, exposure to risk. So we've done a lot of thinking about the importance of coping strategies, but also, again, the importance of safety by design so that children are not put under such pressure to manage their own safety. Well-being is a kind of a number of rights, and we have some nuanced findings showing that digital literacy helps with well-being, promotes well-being, but isn't guaranteed. It does depend on the kinds of digital skills they develop. It does depend on the other factors in children's lives. And the same we could say for development. And the principle of development bundles together children's right to learn, to education, to develop to their fullest, the right to play and to cultural heritage. There's a number of rights there, not all of which we measured, some of which we may need another research project for. But again, we see the ways in which the dimensions matter. And agency, finally, is the idea that, as we heard from your member of Parliament earlier, the importance of digital literacy as giving children the tools against a risky by design digital environment in which the algorithms are often pushing them in directions that they didn't anticipate and may not understand the consequences of. And again, we see some positive findings there, but we also see some ways in which digital literacy skills are not yet sufficiently developed, perhaps cannot be sufficiently developed. So that balance between literacy, education, and regulation or business practices is really crucial. So I'm going to end now and pass to Fabiola. And I see I've gone on slightly too long, but you should take your 10 minutes anyway. We end with some brief recommendations about anticipating the importance of disadvantage and marginality among children, about carefully assessing the dimensions of their skills, supporting educators, as we've already discussed, and really taking a lead from children and children's voices themselves. And I will stop there. This is, Rita, I hope this doesn't give you a heart attack. This is what, this is how PowerPoint suggested I might like to rearrange your interactive version of our report, which actually is more orderly online. But anyway, I thought it a bit fun. So thank you so much.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having your child today. We're very honored and delighted to be able to comment on this wonderful research, especially because we have seen digital literacy in the last decades as more of a ticking box exercise in many cases, and it still is in many cases a ticking box exercise. So seeing the link between digital skills and children's rights so explicitly made and wonderfully explained by Sonia, it's a really good starting point to reject a little bit digital literacy as the magic solution, the one-stop solution, and move and go a little bit beyond that, and also try to use this to frame policy and to inform policy in a way that it's comprehensive and it reaches all children. And as you have mentioned before and very well mapped out the general comment number 25, I don't know how you did that, but because it is a very wide and far-reaching instrument. I just want to delve into a couple of aspects of what Sonia presented today. And first, I want to bring the general comment down to reality with three very clear examples of how children's rights are not being realized online nowadays. The first has to do with the first element that we discussed about equity and the principle of non-discrimination. And we know that 5.4% of children are digitally deprived in Europe. The right to education is not a right that it's fundamentally still guaranteed in many parts of Europe, and I'm not even going to say beyond Europe. So moving away, the building of the digital skills away from only education policy could be a good way to also reach further and beyond. The second is that the general comment says that children have to be protected from violence online. But we know that 1 in 5 children in Europe are falling victims of child sexual abuse. And every 2 seconds, an image of child sexual abuse material is disseminated online. So there is quite a lot to do in that sphere yet. And another example is the best interests of the child, which is also safeguarded under the general comment and under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But we know that currently online platforms and service providers, they prioritize commercial interests over and design over children's best interest. So I think that these are just a few examples of how real the convention actually is, and how you can bring down that kind of theoretical, right, formulation of it to our daily life. And I just want to delve a little bit into elements that you raised, Sonia. The first is that after reading a little bit the results from the ySKILLS, we are seeing a huge potential of digital skills to bridge kind of the inequity and inequality and different digital divides that are across the internet, and taking into account that vulnerable groups could benefit particularly from the building of the digital skills. It may be a way forward to pave more local community-guided interventions through digital skills. I'm also thinking that child rights impact assessments could also be a way forward in ensuring that digital skills are embedded in a comprehensive toolset, right, of actions. A second point that I want to touch upon is the point of shared responsibility. I figured you would know, right, that your child would jump into this. And it's good that you raised the code of conduct, because actually as members of the group that is drafting the code of conduct on age-appropriate design, we will be very happy to bring this research to the group as a bit of a grounding exercise. But in another piece of work that Eurochild is doing consulting children, which is the Voice project, which we are coordinating with ECPAT International and Terre des Hommes Netherlands, and with which we are consulting around 340 children across the globe, across 15 countries. We are seeing two trends that could be interesting to raise here. One is the normalization of violence. And I think it was also raised by the ySKILLS in the research. And it's that we're seeing that children are turning to adults only when the danger is very serious, or at least that the threshold for actually asking for support, it's becoming higher and higher. They are starting to see online risks as a part of the experience, as a given in these platforms. And I have a feeling that digital skills, if approached in more holistic interventions, could be a way to adapt to the evolving needs of children, and to essentially build age-appropriate, safer online experiences. The other trend that we are seeing is about the shared responsibility, as I mentioned, which is that parents, because to complement in this project, the project that I mentioned, Voice, to complement the children's input, we also surveyed parents, and we surveyed around 6,000 parents around those 15 countries. And they are highlighting that they are the ones taking most of the responsibility in guaranteeing online safety of their children and the exercise of their rights online. And we are seeing a similar trend with children. And that trend of children assuming that user responsibility is linked to their aspiration to have agency. And this is the link that I want to make with the strong point that I want to make about how digital skills can fully empower the exercise of children's rights through building their agency, through giving them the tools to make informed choices. And that, for them, is becoming more and more the way forward, at least as we're listening from them. And for this, it's not only about building their digital skills. It's also about promoting, empowering digital designs. It's about convincing online service providers to create experiences that are not only age appropriate, but that allow children to make those decisions for themselves. And informed decisions with child-friendly information with accessible tools, with accessible functionalities, and with honest information. And on the other side of the coin, strong regulation that promotes these kind of features and these kind of approaches. As I said, and I think Sonia very, very well portrayed, this holistic approach is needed across policymakers, across online service providers, schools, teachers, parents, across the whole variety of stakeholders. And if we manage to really create an approach to digital skills that can promote the right to participation, the right to have their voices heard, the right to privacy and protection equally, then it would be a huge success, I would say. Thank you.